Resident Evil Requiem is shaping up to be an absolute beast of a game. We've got two protagonists with Grace Ashcroft and Leon S. Kennedy, with both characters representing their own unique and distinct gameplay. On top of the game marrying these two contrasting styles, the more survival horror gameplay for Grace and the more tense action gameplay for Leon, we've essentially got two very different playing versions of the game, with the title having been built from the ground up with fully featured first-person and third-person gameplay that can be changed at any point. That's a whole lot of game right there, and with Capcom giving us a ballpark indication that the game's runtime will result in it being one of the longer titles in the franchise, along with recent leaks and rumors suggesting that the game will be receiving DLC, just how massive can we expect this next mainline Resident Evil to be? Let's go over everything we know, both confirmed and rumored, about the potential size and scale of Resident Evil Requiem. So help a brother out and strike that like button if you're like me and can't wait to play this game in a month's time. And heck, if you're interested in playing the Deluxe edition of this game for free and for the platform of your choice, participate in my ongoing giveaway of the title, where I will be giving away 3 copies. All details are provided in the description. Alright, let's dive into what Capcom officially stated regarding the length of Resident Evil Requiem. In an interview with Italian publication EveryEye, RE9 producer Masato Kumazawa discussed that the average playtime was to be most similar to that of Resident Evil 4 Remake's length, with "We're aiming for a playthrough roughly similar to that of Resident Evil 4 Remake." Kumazawa went further with, "I think that each game, depending on how it is approached, takes a different time, and not necessarily specifically compared to Resident Evil 4, but I would say that in most of the main chapters, it has roughly the same volume of gameplay." So, we could say it like this: you can expect a quantity of content in line with that of a typical Resident Evil. Alright, so with the producer saying that most of the chapters in Resident Evil 9 fare similarly to the volume that was present in Resident Evil 4 Remake's chapters, this definitely suggests that Requiem, at least from the perspective of Capcom, is seeking to achieve a similar runtime to that of Resident Evil 4 Remake, a game that is easily one of the largest titles in the series. Now, of course, we all play through games at a different pace, just as Kumazawa stated, with many players, such as myself, finishing RE4 Remake on a first playthrough with a time in the 25+ hour range, but even considering this number is likely not the typical first-time playthrough length, seeing as I'm sure not everyone tried to find all collectibles, complete all challenges, and side quests in their first playthrough, it's likely the average completion that Capcom is aiming to achieve with RE9 sits closer to RE4 Remake's average 16-hour playthrough as measured on howlongtobeat.com. Again, we all work through these games at our own paces, but considering Capcom is letting us know that this game's length is most closely comparable to the length of RE4 Remake suggests that we are looking at a pretty substantial Resident Evil game ahead of us in RE Requiem. Now, the number that Capcom suggested in this interview matters somewhat because it tells us what Capcom is aiming for here. Not a small, tightly crafted, extra linear experience akin to what we got in, say, Resident Evil 3 Remake, and not an overly gratuitous, lengthy game that spans several playable characters that came at the expense of tight, well-paced gameplay like Resident Evil 6. It suggests that Requiem is trying to sit in that sweet spot where the game feels substantial on a first run, but still invites replayability the same way Resident Evil always has, where your second playthrough is usually faster, cleaner, more confident, and more mechanical. But here's the thing. That 15-hour range that Capcom may be aiming for does not describe one unified experience. Requiem's defining structural choice is that it is built around two protagonists with two distinct gameplay identities. Grace Ashcroft and Leon S. Kennedy aren't just two different character models with different weapons running through potentially different environments and the like. They represent two different philosophies of Resident Evil design living inside one mainline title. And if the split ends up being relatively even, as Capcom themselves have confirmed, then you're not looking solely at just the roughly 15-hour runtime. You're essentially looking at two experiences that interlock, contrast, and complement each other. with Resident Evil 9 director Koshi Nakanishi telling Famitsu in mid-December last year that both Grace and Leon's gameplay will be roughly split half and half across the game's duration, and with the two characters representing contrasting gameplay styles, that 15-hour estimation by Capcom could fluctuate significantly more over a game like RE4, and this is where the idea of length becomes way more interesting than just a raw hour count. Grace's sections, according to the gameplay we've seen and from what Capcom has been telling us, are built to increase friction and build tension through survival horror gameplay. The scarcity of resources changes how long an area takes. Fear changes how long a hallway takes. Not knowing what's behind the next door changes how long a decision takes. In a survival horror leaning campaign, you don't just walk into a room and clear it. I mean, of course you can. You test the space, you read it, you consider how much ammo you're willing to spend, or if you should even engage enemies at all, as pointed out by Capcom in the recent RE showcase. This alone stretches time in a way action games can't easily replicate on a first playthrough, because the same corridor can take 30 seconds in an action segment and 3 minutes in a survival segment, because one is about forward momentum and the other is about threat assessment. Capcom keeps touting Grace as the most fragile and easily scared protagonist of any RE game, and while they also hint that she gradually gains more confidence throughout the game, her core gameplay identity is solidly being described as survival horror, with Capcom specifically mentioning Resident Evil 2 Remake and RE7. Leon's sections, on the other hand, are built around action laced with deep atmosphere, commonly referred to as action horror. Leon is the kind of protagonist who makes the environment feel smaller because he can impose himself on it. His gameplay identity naturally lends itself to more confident engagement and faster resolution of encounters, but that doesn't mean it's mindless. If anything, action-heavy Resident Evil is at its best when the combat has depth, when positioning matters, and when you're making small tactical choices constantly. But the point is that Leon's side is designed to create a sensation of flow. You're still under threat, but you're less likely to be paralyzed by it. Your decisions become less about, can I afford to do this? And more about, what's the smartest way to do this? Now, I figure, let's go over some things that have been rumored about the game as they relate to Resident Evil 9's general length, and with leaks and rumors, please go in with a grain of salt. Infamous leaker and rumor monger Dusk Golem, who leaked Leon's existence in the game nearly a half a year before Leon's official announcement, recently touted that Leon's chapters are a bit larger in scope than Grace's, which, I mean, makes sense since they both reflect different styles of Resident Evil gameplay. But more interesting is that Dusk claimed that Leon's and Grace's chapters contain optional side content. Now, this side content could be something similar to how RE4 Remake handled side content, with maybe a shooting range that dishes out rewards, or even side quests could be present, like shooting medallions, overcoming mini-bosses, and the like. Without a merchant being in the game, as this is something Capcom has confirmed, I wonder how RE9 would go about administering side quests, but yeah. This optional content within Requiem's core chapters could greatly increase the length of the title, just as it definitely made the length of my first RE4 Remake playthrough go into the 25+ hour range. Now, outside of the core RE9 experience, there's no word yet if the mercenaries will be present, although just going off recent RE releases like RE Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake, I could definitely imagine seeing the mercenaries or raid mode or something similar appear in RE9, and if it's not at launch, it could definitely come later in an update. Speaking of updates and DLC, Dusk stated in November last year that DLC was in development for the title, with the most likely DLC starring Alyssa Ashcroft, the mother of Grace, who was also a playable character in the Resident Evil Outbreak titles. Just days ago, Dusk reiterated that Alyssa was still likely going to star in this potential DLC, but again, these are all just rumors and we won't know until Capcom releases more info. Considering that it's currently the 30th anniversary of Resident Evil and that Capcom will be making announcements and celebrations throughout the year, it's definitely likely we could see the announcement of DLC and updates to Requiem as we progress through the year. Resident Evil Requiem is certainly shaping up to be a meaty game. It may not be the absolute longest game in the series, but it certainly won't end up being the shortest. If Capcom is able to pull off the balance between Grace and Leon's contrasting chapters, the length of the game honestly won't be much of a talking point here, because the best Resident Evil games don't feel long. They feel dense. They feel like every room is a decision, every item is purposely there, and every encounter is a lesson you apply on the next run. And that's why Requiem's dual protagonist structure is so important here, for RE in general and also in longevity. It's not just a narrative gimmick, it's a pacing machine. It's a way to make the roughly 15 or so hours feel like a full course meal instead of a single flavor stretched thin. In other words, Resident Evil Requiem may not be the longest RE game on paper, but if its structure is as deliberate as it looks, it might be one of the most replayable and one of the most intelligently paced mainline entries Capcom has made in years. Got nothing else for ya? Follow me over to this video if you're curious about what Capcom may have in store for us beyond RE Requiem this year as the franchise celebrates its 30th anniversary. And I will see you all real soon in the next one.